Welcome to Lecture 26 of our series on prosody. People differ in their prosodic behavior. In Lecture 20, I discussed differences that can be used for identifying speakers and for diagnosing medical conditions. In this lecture, we focus on differences in prosodic skills and effectiveness, some of which have deep genetic and neural roots. So, suppose you're a communicating entity in conversation with someone. There will be a lot going on inside your head regarding prosody. So let's break it down in terms of the processes and representations and how these things can vary among individuals. So in overview, you need to extract from prosody information to let you grasp the current situation, especially regarding your interlocutor's intents and micro-intents moment by moment, and then decide how you want to respond and convey that intent back to your interlocutor. At this level, things resemble the diagram in the previous lecture, but there we go, sort of a word-centric, content-centric view. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the prosodic aspects of dialogue exclusively. So, I'm breaking it down. To start, you obviously need the ability to perceive prosody. People vary in how well they can do this, at least for pitch perception. Pitch perception being the best studied aspect. So there's actually a genetic connection to the ASPM gene. People with the TT variant do better than those with the TC or CC variants, at least for recognizing Cantonese tones. Now this gene disproportionately affects brain volume in the auditory cortex, in Herschel's gyrus. And the TT variant is more common, interestingly, in many populations that speak tone languages. But don't despair if you want to learn a tone language, but you lack this gene. Its effect on performance is dwarfed by the effect of musical training and probably other factors like practice. More serious is amusica, the condition also known as tone deafness. More specifically relating to speech, there's prosody, which can result from alcohol abuse in early childhood. And both of these conditions can result from strokes, among other causes. Okay, so after low-level perception, a lot more has to happen. These other mental processes are even less well understood, so this lecture is going to be high-level and a little bit speculative at times. Now, prosodic deficits are a factor in some medical conditions, actually quite a few, but I'll make connections mostly to autism. Considering some extreme cases like autism can be a way to better understand prosody in normal people, in quotes, who also show significant variation in everything we'll discuss. All right, so to get from those low-level percepts to meaning, you need to identify which of the meaningful configurations of your language are present in what you hear. This process involves the integration of multiple streams of prosodic information, each rapidly varying. It also requires that you have knowledge of what those meaningful configurations are for the languages you're speaking. Just as some people have larger vocabularies or smaller vocabularies, it seems that some people, even native speakers, have larger or smaller inventories of prosodic constructions. And some people have different ones. One autistic child we studied has his own way of marking contrast, as in contrast expectation, something new, surprising. We missed it at the time. It just seemed to be a kind of weird, random behavior, but it turned out he was consistently using a specific pattern. He had his own personal variant of English. Okay, so why such variation? I mean, learning these things requires a lot of connected abilities. To learn prosodic constructions, you need to learn form-function mappings, which means you need to be able to process both sides. There's the perception difficulties, but if you have difficulty tracking what's going on socially in interaction, like many autistic children, and your input is kaleidoscopic patterns of prosodic form without anything to ground them in, you're going to have trouble. It's also been suggested that some people with autism may have weaker long-distance neural connections, in particular for the neural pathways that enable us to connect social meanings and social rewards with prosodic behaviors that can yield them. Okay, so now even if you've understood the constructions and looked up their general meanings, that massively underdetermines the actual meanings in context. I have a friend who can say the word interesting in a way that sometimes means you're an idiot. Figuring out the actual meaning for any given input requires both context awareness and theory of mind abilities. That is the ability to infer what someone else is thinking. People vary greatly in such skills, from truly empathic listeners to those who have barely a clue. While weaknesses here is not specifically a prosodic deficit, it can certainly limit one's ability to make use of the prosodic information in the input. Okay, so even if all that went well, enabling you to grasp what's going on and formulate your intention, you still have to express it. To do this, first you have to access your knowledge of prosodic constructions again, to pull out those that you need to express your intent. Usually this involves multiple patterns which need to be assembled into a coherent prosodic plan. And some people may have trouble with any or all of these aspects. In particular, the assembly process is really far from trivial. Some people struggle with concatenating the prosody of beyond a word or phrase into larger prosodic structures. Superposition is challenging, alignment also. Returning to the autistic question, some autistic children do better relatively with the rule-based, more phonological aspects of prosody, like marking lexical stress, over the more social and context-dependent aspects of prosody. Maybe for this reason, some autistic children are perceived as having a sort of pedantic style. The language is very correct, syntactically and phonologically, but the social meanings are not coming through. Perception as a pedantic style is sort of an interesting issue. To properly make sense of styles and how they are perceived and misperceived, that would be a story in itself. Anyway, next comes the task of executing the plan. This can also be a challenge. Some people seem to lack precise prosodic control. For example, some people with autism seem to have occasional, almost random variations in pitch or intensity, sometimes together with weak motor coordination in general. To execute a plan successfully also requires good self-perception and self-monitoring ability. And again, people vary in how well they perform on these tasks. No matter what the reason, poorly controlled variation can certainly be a problem. For interlocutors who look for meaning in every little prosodic nuance, which is probably most of us, such uncontrolled variation can easily cause confusion or downright misinterpretations. There can also, conversely, be too little variation. Some people never vary some dimension of prosody. For example, some autistic speakers are persistently nasal, others persistently too loud, too quiet, monotone, and so on. For this, there could be many reasons beyond control difficulties. Monotone pitch, for example, can be a kind of mitigation strategy, in the sense that if you're not good at predicting whether people will appreciate your intent or take offense at what you do prosodically, it's safer just to be cautious. Always monotone is a safe strategy. Now, nobody much enjoys interacting with robots or robotic speakers, but they also don't get annoyed by them. Okay, so now we've mapped out the long path of processes involved in using prosody in conversation. There's also a shorter path for turn-taking. A swift, fluent exchange of turns is a hallmark of truly satisfying interaction. Being in sync with someone is a wonderful feeling. As mentioned earlier, prosody plays a role in this, in holding the floor, signaling turn yields, cueing back-channel feedback, responding, and so on. And there's a fairly small window, in many cases, for doing this successfully, a few hundred milliseconds. And if you delay, you'll seem disengaged. So there's a lot of mental things that have to happen in those few hundred milliseconds. You have to catch your interlocutor's signals and also signal your own intentions. For example, by producing a filled pause with the right prosody if you want to continue but need time to think of a word. This also requires some metacognitive awareness of the moment-to-moment state of your own formulation processes. Lots of challenges, lots of things that can go wrong, lots of reasons why people really do vary in their prosodic abilities. Well, this lecture overall, we can say there's two big points. There are a lot of things involved in using prosody effectively, and there is a lot of variation among people. Occasionally when I give a talk on prosody, someone comes up afterwards and says something like, "That was a great talk and everything made sense, but personally I just don't hear those things at all." I always reinsure them. That's not unusual. Truly, the scope of normal variation in prosodic abilities and behaviors is very wide. And it's not just that some are good in prosody and become lawyers and salesmen, others less good and go on to become cabinet makers or computer science professors. Rather, there's multiple dimensions of multifaceted variation across many skill components. So people are complicated. Well, that wraps it up for individual differences. Many are brain-related, but not all are fixed for life. There are many ways to help people become more effective with prosody. So our next lecture will be about the teaching of prosodic skills.